I said, you know, by the way, I have the book, and James said, well, let's try to do something. So I appreciate you all coming. I'm going to do is just kind of give you an outline of what this new book is about, and it has three sort of main sections, and I'll just talk a little bit about each. I'm not going to do a big lecture, and I'm not going to talk too long, because I'd like to have a discussion. I've been to Greece and to really just 3 times now, so I don't put myself in a position where I'm going to tell you anything about your world. If there are things that I present that overlap with your situation, and I suspect there will be some, we can have, you know, sort of a debate about the sort of like similarities and differences, and you know, we'll see where that kind of goes. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you. As James said, this is a kind of follow-up to my last book, which is called Dark Matter. But some of these essays actually precede that book, go back about 2 decades. So there are 3 key areas that the book covers. One is about the art world, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. I sort of present a term called, and I steal this from Agamben, I present the term bare art world, that we are now living or working in a bare art world. The second is Cities Without Souls, which is about gentrification, which I've seen firsthand in New York City now for 40-some years since I moved there from Philadelphia, and also been chased through different parts of the city as I tried to afford it, to the point now where I'm pretty much on the edge, and I don't even know if I can stay there much longer. And then Resistance, which is missing an A here, sorry about that. So, I wanted to just start with this idea of the demystified art world to this idea of bare art, because when I went to New York City, I studied with Hans Hacke, and Hans Hacke was well known as an artist who sort of tried to peel away the veneer of the art world to show you what was going on behind it, right? He did a lot of research. Later, this was called institutional critique. It wasn't even called that at the time, but that was a term that came in later. So he tried to demystify the world, and I was very much part of that thinking as a young artist. I think we've moved into a different phase now. That's what I'll try to talk about. I also think you can't look at this without thinking about the Cold War and the relations, particularly between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although, you know, I know from history, of course, Greece was absolutely at the center of that situation, particularly in the post-World War II period. But when I was only 2 years old, the Soviets launched our little traveler, the Sputnik, and in many ways I realized that my education, because I didn't pay a lot for my education, I'm not in debt because of that, is due to this little satellite. Gulf, the spin-off group, decided to take more direct action. And so on a number of occasions, they actually invaded the Guggenheim and created a disruption. In 2015, on May Day, and I was involved in this action as well, we went in, someone was basically in a wheelchair. She didn't need the wheelchair. Underneath her was this parachute banner. At 10 o'clock in the morning, she leapt off it, and out came the banner. Very quickly, the guards kind of came and tore it up. Meanwhile, we had people positioned upstairs in the atrium. This is, of course, the Frank Lloyd Wright building on 5th Avenue in New York, dropping leaflets. And this is what it looked like down below. And the leaflets said Mayday in different languages. There were also things like this, talking about the relationship of petrodollars to the art world, to the Guggenheim, and so on and so forth. On that particular day, previous interventions, they had come, done something, and left. On that particular day, the decision was made to occupy the museum, and everyone sat down. At a certain point, the museum called the police. They gradually let people leave the museum, but they wouldn't let anyone new come in. So the museum emptied out, and we sat there for maybe an hour or more. The police came. One of the police said to us, you know, we're just waiting for the car to come to take you away. And we took a risk because we thought, is the museum really going to have a bunch of artists dragged out of here, you know, in handcuffs? And of course the police just vanished at a certain point. And we had the entire museum to ourselves. It was very strange and surreal. We could walk around and see all the exhibitions. It was just the guards and a couple of people doing an on Karawa sort of performance in the window. Very surreal. strange thing was a number of us had tickets to go to Venice the next day, and so we were really hoping we weren't sent to prison overnight. I just want to read two more things. This is one of them, because I think Gulf really had sort of an interesting perspective. And as our name aggressively reflects back to the actually existing art world, I can call it the bare art world, its true nature, a spectacular subsystem of global capitalism revolving around the display, consumption, and financialization of cultural objects, flippable art, etc., for the benefit of a tiny fraction of humanity, namely the 1%. They have a very interesting manifesto, which I can share with you as well. The next day, we went to Venice because there was the opening of the Venice Biennale, and Gulf Labor, the sort of more official group that sits down with the museum, was invited by Oakley and Wizard to be part of the exhibition. We actually took a lot of money, as much money as we could get from them, and we went to Abu Dhabi, and we went to India, and we interviewed workers, and that was what we used most of the money for. But for the opening, Gulf, the activist faction, decided to stage a little activity, and we organized with an organization, an autonomous space, somewhat similar to this one called Sally Docks, which means salt docks, which is in the city of Venice, and it has been occupied for 6 or 7 years now. And they got some boats together, we made banners, we took off from the landing from Sally Docks, which is just around the corner from the Peggy Guggenheim collection, and we landed on the docks, and we took it over. And we set up our banners, and of course this is the dock on the Grand Canal for the museum. It's 2050. At one point we thought we're in deep shit. Turns out it was an art project. Of course. We succeeded this time in accomplishing something. Finally, the museum director here said, okay, what do you want? We want to meet with the board of directors. Because up to now we've been meeting with the Richard, who was just the sort of CEO, you might say, of the museum, Richard Armstrong. We want to meet with the board of directors because they really have the power to make decisions. And they agreed. And so we went back to New York, we met with them, period of months. We brought NGOs in to talk about fair contracts that could be used in the Middle East, all kinds of things. And then one day they just called us and said, we're not going to have anything more to do with you, that's it. And so we went and we did another intervention, just saying that they sort of broke trust with us. And so far we've had no more negotiations. On the other hand, the museum itself has been put on hold, and it's complicated. I want to end by showing a different project though, because this is a project at the Brooklyn Art Museum. This is not the exhibition. This is a work in the street by activists. Because these are private institutions, and they could just say, well, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. Just like in the US, we have this ability for people to get together and pump money into people's campaigns, but not disclose who they are. And this was a Supreme Court decision that was really a nightmare for all of us, and it continues to be. So it's similar, I think, in that way.
No, because that's exactly what she's doing, Andrea. She's looking into what political donations all these big benefactors, if we want to call them, of museums have done. So I think it is very much linked with the current administration in the States, and whether there is kind of like a film of conservatives that is covering the museums. Although we have seen from the museums themselves lately, after the elections in the States, I'm not going to say dissidents, because it's not really dissidents, but a kind of behavior that tries to go against the current administration. I also wanted to ask you about that, whether you feel that is in fact concrete a reaction, or whether it's just for the sake of it, in order for them to look democratic enough, if you will.
I think it's museums basically ever since I began my talk before you got here with Hans Hake, who was my professor, and of course Hake did this sort of survey of people who went to art galleries and museums back in 1973 or 72 even, and discovered kind of what we already know, which is that most people who go to museums in the art world tend to be either liberals or even maybe to the left of liberals. Very few are conservatives. So museums absolutely, in order to sort of be legitimate, are going to have to pay some attention to their constituency. And with groups like Gulf Labor and Gulf Occupy Museums, Working Artists for Greater Economy, and so on and so forth, putting pressure on those institutions, they're going to have to respond by doing something that shows they still are politically in their camp. I think in the book somewhere I talk about this as a kind of prog-servatism, progressive conservatism, because they can speak about these things, or LGBT rights, or things like that, very important things, but when it comes to actually changing the structure of the institution, say making the boards of directors more diverse, or getting rid of people like Larry Fink off the board, they're not going to do that. So yes, I think until we target that aspect of it, we don't succeed. We really just get gestures. And it's great to have the gestures, of course. No one wants to say, don't do that. Right now, the Museum of Modern Art has a vitrine set out with Art Workers Coalition material in it. And Art Workers Coalition invaded the museum many times in the 70s. So they had that material, but they kind of put it away in the archive. Now they bring it out. They also put work up by Syrian artists and other artists from the Middle East in their collection. All of this is great, but it doesn't get to the core aspect of the problem.
That was my kind of next thought, in the sense that many times in the cultural field, especially when it comes to socially and politically engaged practices, curatorial ones or artistic, and we have seen that here in Athens as well. You said gestures, they're just gestures. I call them empty gestures even.
Gesture of art is an important part of, I love Jackson Pollock, so let's not be completely against the gesture.
No, absolutely. I'm just saying it's a bit of a conundrum and a cul-de-sac, if you want, in the sense that you do have a discourse, but how much active agency does art have to change? This is the question that we all face, but I think we are currently at a moment that the times are so hard that it's inevitable somehow for us to pick a field, a position, if you will. And I wanted to ask, because I'm not very familiar with the current situation of the art world in the United States. I haven't been for quite some time. Whether that is difficult within the realm of socially and politically engaged projects. And I was speaking with Nathan Thompson a month ago. He was here. I mean, he was very kind of disheartened by the whole thing. So I just wanted your opinion, really.
Well, yeah, NATO and I go back a long way to Chicago, actually. It is disheartening. I mean, but I think the idea that artists are going to change the politics is probably naive. I don't think that's ever happened. I think artists have a tendency to follow more the political landscape than they do to really make it. And it may have shifted a little bit, even in, I think, the revolutionary Russia in place. In a way, artists were caught up in a moment that was much bigger than they were. And I think if we lose sight of that, artists cannot change society through art. It just isn't going to happen. Did you want to...
Quiz.
Is that okay, or do you want to continue?
It's okay.
Someone had a question. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Sorry, yeah. I just read on the internet you live in Amsterdam, Rotterdam also, yeah?
Partly based in Rotterdam.
Yeah, okay. Well, I come from Amsterdam, and what's happening in Amsterdam is absolutely horrifying. We have 700,000 citizens, and now daily 500,000 tourists. You can't walk.
You are Airbnb capital now, I think.
Right.
Thank God I'm in Rotterdam, so I'm avoiding all that.
Well, that's interesting, because I think Rotterdam achieved much better than Amsterdam to include activism and art somehow in the Rotterdam architecture than Amsterdam. Right now, in the north of Amsterdam, there is this territory that's called Enesden Island, which is really where there are big containers for artists. People have ateliers. It's actually want
You're
to...
talking above the station, yeah, after Toll House,
Yeah,
right?
okay. And they do all kinds of festivals, and it's really great. Now, you were talking about the connection between politics and art. I can hardly say to you, I'm so ashamed, but the two biggest political parties in Amsterdam, in the municipality, want to veto the right of these artists that live there to do their festivals.
Are you talking about VVD?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but
VVD
they're right.
and C.A.S.A. And because they say these artists are already subsidized, we gave them, cheap possibility to have ateliers and live, and they should not be, they should not have the right to make money, although they are already subsidized. And this, Greece now was a big shock to read. My question is, what can we do against it? Because it's obvious that it's horrifying. One article after the other appears and is published, like we have to go against this. But somewhere there are these forces, and we don't seem to be able to stop it. What can we do to stop it? I love this neighborhood, Metar Sorrio, but the same will happen here if we don't do something. What should we really do?
Well, that's a heavy question for us to answer.
Read the book.
Yeah, read Gregory's book, and maybe we'll together find a solution. For me, okay, I will answer with an example, right? I was in Argentina a year ago. I was talking with an artist that is 72 years old. He was one of the first Fluxus artists.
Yeah, that's an interesting story.
Yeah, very much so, I have to say. So he was one of the first Fluxus artists, and of course, because he was in Argentina and he didn't speak English, he was not as famous as the rest of them. And he said to me, his name is Roberto Jacobi. I said to him, it's really horrible, the situation. I was being frustrated just like you. And I said to him, what can we do? And he said to me, I'm sorry to say it, he said to me, sorry kiddo, you're fucked.
Yeah. Well,
There's nothing to do, and he said the only thing that you can do is try to change things within your immediate constituency, like the people around you, your friends, your networks. You can't change in the large scale, and if you think that you can, then you're just hitting your head upon the wall.
Okay.
So I don't know if that is an answer.
But you know how hard it is, because we are all experiencing an economic crisis. Greece even more than ever, and in the whole of the EU.
No, as Dijsselbloem said, whiskey and women.
Yeah,
we're having great
yeah.
fun here.
And as the Spanish dude said, hey, we're Spanish, alcohol is cheap and we don't have to pay for it. But for example, I left my house in Amsterdam and I subletted to Bulgarians, and I get criticism of my own left-wing friends that I rented out for a low price. Now, can you understand this? My own left-wing friends, they said, Ingeborg, you're crazy, you should ask 2,500 a month, easy for your apartment, and I don't want to go about 1,500. So there's, in my own environment, a lot of pressure on me, because they want me to up the price, and I said, no, I don't want to gentrify, I don't want to do Airbnb, I like these Bulgarians, I keep it on that level. And they all tell me, you're crazy, you're a thief of your own portemonnaie.
There's a great book I recommend by a man who died only about a year ago, a wonderful thinker, Randy Martin, and it's called The Financialization of Everyday Life. And it really talks about the way this kind of language or grammar of finance and capital has infiltrated every level of our consciousness in many parts of the world, obviously, in our parts of the world, let's say. So that this is how we think. And unfortunately, it's in the art world, this is why I describe it as a kind of bare art world, because the sort of relationships between capital and art have become so much more obvious. And I think that part of what we have to begin to do, and I try to come up with something positive, because I think it is a very grim situation, is precisely the kind of things you're saying, is like to say to your friends, it's outrageous, this is what I should be doing, and you should be doing the same thing. And push back against that need to monetize everything, find ways of distributing, giving things away, whatever is possible to sort of, overcome that situation. I think it's complicated in the sense that financial capital almost seems to have no reliance on labor. I think that I would just change that a little bit, in that its ideal is the long-term capitalist dream of making money without having labor. You make it by magic, you invest in something and boom, you get more capital, and there's no need to go through the commodity cycle, which would require, actual wage labor at some level, right? So I think financialization is really bizarre in that it actually seems to think, at least, that it can create money out of sort of money, right? Skipping over the whole process, right? M equals M, not M equals C equals M. Crazy. Okay. But what might be, and I think if I can come off with what you're saying, is this kind of zone of affect, and everything else that's subsumed, if I can use that word, right, by capitalism. Just as the art world, I would argue, has been subsumed. And I don't know if there's any hardcore Marxists here. We can argue about whether that's the formal subsumption or the actual subsumption. These are, huge debates amongst about 10 people in the world. But one way or the other, there's a kind of subsumption that's happened that even the realm of art, which we always think of as the realm of liberty and freedom, is now part of the cycle of capital, right?
Examples now from 2008 and onwards, which it's occurring. And I mean, you being in a home and assembling and discussing is also, it's also an assembly, unless you mean an official assembly that keeps notes. Okay. Also, you spoke about the 90s. There were, of course, then artists as well that were engaged with these practices, but because the 90s was a financial prosperity period of kind of an extreme surge of capitalism, there were less of them. It's very much related. I personally cannot disconnect the two. I think when you have financial prosperity, and you also remember that in Greece we had all the Delors packages from the European Union, it was a fantastic period in these 10 years. Between 90 and 2000. Of course, there was no need for this type of practice, but I don't agree that it doesn't exist now. I think there are a lot of artists currently that are dealing with these issues because they are needed, and I don't think we should also blame some artists that they don't have these practices, because when it is needed, maybe they will come forward and have these practices. It's also a matter of engagement and urgency.
I did want to. I was struck by the sort of the shape of your analysis, because I get a sense that my own take on it, and also I wrote a book a number of years ago called Collectivism After Modernism with Blake Stimson, where we put forward something similar to what you're saying, which is to say that in the modernist period you had Dada, you had Surrealism, and they were fairly organized and structured around certain personalities and certain sort of aesthetics even. People could actually be put on trial and ejected from the group. Of course, this carries over all the way to the Situationists to some degree, right? And then in the sort of so-called, I don't know, let's call it the postmodern or whatever you want to call it, we have collectives, we see collectives, but what they are often non-ideological and not aesthetically oriented, but individuals, very plastic, and people just kind of doing their thing, and they're all getting together in some space because it's convenient, because it's affordable, it makes it possible to sort of do things. So we had sort of groups like Derandra or Force Field in the United States, and they would make some music and they would get some things together and they would hang out and people would come and go from the group. But there was none of that kind of structure that we saw from that previous modernist period. It was much more freedom. And there was no real commitment, and there was no ideological sort of perspective, except that they were doing these things. As the alternative space movement died in the US because there was no more funding coming down, I think the collectives, these little collectives, began to kind of take that space in the ecology of the art world. So if you were a young artist coming out of art school, you would join a collective. The collective didn't have any idea, it didn't have a politics necessarily, but you would do it because it was a way to work with other people, to get a little visibility, And then the exhibition spaces like the Whitney Biennial started to show these collectives, I call them whatever collectives. They're like whatever. They're kind of ambient collectives, right? I think it's very interesting what you're saying though, is like now there is this kind of possibility of maybe a kind of assembly out of that. And I would suggest maybe one possibility is because after the crash, after the 2008 and after Occupy, etc., a lot more emphasis on social production and the visibility of social production. There's a lot less of that mythology that artists are these kind of lone individuals who stand outside of history, they stand outside of society, they're islands. No, I think we all recognize, I'm babysitting your cat so you could make a painting. Let's face it, we're all working together to produce this thing called art. And I think that visibility has actually also allowed more of a sense of the social labor that goes into art to be visible. And I think that's where we are, and I think that could be a very positive thing. It could be.
So what are your thoughts?
I find myself more and more falling in a downward spiral as a creator and also as a facilitator by confronting from one side socially engaging in political art that turns more and more instrumentalized, and at the same time becoming from emerging to dominant. We see this year's documentary, for example, being built around this type of art. We see that the secondary, I was growing up in a time when we had the primary and the secondary market. Now we see that we have more markets, and we definitely see there's a particular market for this type of art as well. And at the same time, the second part of my concern is that we see the emerging of a new morality that is built around exactly this kind of practices. For example, we see that artists are engaging in these practices, are using more and more in their language things that are built on beliefs, not only political beliefs, but also personal beliefs. Therefore, although starting progressive, they're building barriers. And at the same time that we see that everyone and everything is built around beliefs, at least across the ocean, I'm really afraid that maybe we are becoming socially engaging and political artists are becoming, so to speak, the avant-garde of a new reactionary stream. Exactly the opposite of what it started being. And I would like to hear your reflection on that.
So it's reactionary because it pivots on this undetermined kind of notion of morality that's not really very clarified, maybe?
Because it's, first of all, it's being built around beliefs. Such as goodness, for example, which who is to define these manifesting things about good and bad that's keep on popping up more and more recently, and we used to abandon these as old-fashioned post-Christian whatever doctrines that we really didn't want anything to do with them. But we see them come again and again more vividly through maybe escapism in art, or through ecofascism. It's not really fascism, but it's still that radical ecology that has traits of fascism. And I can go more and more on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, your observations, I think, are pretty spot on, I think. I mean, in the US, it's a little, I can only look at the situation that I'm really familiar with, which is in the US. I would say at this point, you cannot make formalist art anymore, If you make let's say a monochromatic painting and put it in a gallery, you better have an explanation for how it relates to society beside it. Right? It's the color of the sky over Tahrir Square, It's not just blue. And it's permeated every aspect of academia, and I'm completely to be blamed for this as well. Hans Hacke, my professor, me, Martha Rosler, all the people I know in a way participated in saying, you can't just make art about formal concerns. That's bullshit, You need to think about the sort of social reality of it, and in art history. So there was a time when you could be an art historian and you could look at the raft of the Medusa and talk about shapes and colors and forms and never mention the history that is going on in the painting. It's not possible anymore. But maybe it's now gone to the point where it's impossible to not talk about some aspect of society when you look at, let's say, the work that's in Documenta, and you're digging around, what is the social meaning of this? If it doesn't have a social meaning, then it's worthless to us, right? So I completely agree in that sense, that this is the condition we're in. Whether or not it's reactionary, I don't know, I'd have to think about that some more, in terms of the question of politics. I would still differentiate, though, between those artists who have a political analysis and who try to carry that through in their art, which could actually be completely not very political in its manifestation sometimes. Like if you look at some of Walid Rad's work, it's about a color that hid because the Civil War was going on, but it's sending messages back from the future. I mean, really? Okay. I love it, and I know Walid has a good political analysis, so I don't think it's quite A equals B equals C, but I think you have to look at each instantiation of this in particular. As a general critique, though, I agree with you. There's a kind of free-floating, morality. It has its uses. When we had our recent election, many people took to the streets. People went to the airport when the travel ban was in place. And it wasn't just activists. It wasn't people who had an analysis. It was like everybody, it seemed, because they felt that they could do that. They should do that. They should be activists. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of a generalization of dissent that we've seen happen since November, in the US anyway. If it just remains, though, at a kind of morally indignant level, I think it could easily be used in a very negative way as well. I mean, if it doesn't develop a more critical analysis in an organization, then I would have to say,
social movement can exist also self-organized art in a city. And as long as the artists they have a coalition and participation in the social movement, the art world, the underground art world is empowered, and also the artists can empower the social movement, and the social movement defends the artists. In a way, we cannot expect anymore, the art to change the world. Okay, this was a early 20th century idea that seemed to fail. But we can continue believing that the art can change the people that will change the world. This means that we cannot have an isolated art space that can defend itself. As long as existing social movement in a city, the artists will empower the social movement and the social movement will defend the place. And also we cannot have underground art as long as you don't have confrontation with the police in a city. Because the power of the gentrification is very strong, the power of the state is very strong, the power of the money is very strong. So as long as you have social movement against state and against capitalism, then you can defend some spaces that they can have social activities, art activities, cultural activities, and also political activities. So for us, it's the cultural activities, the social activities, and the political activities, they have to be together. As long as they don't exist together, the political activities, they don't have aesthetics, the art activities, they don't have meaning, and the social activities, they don't have power. I will give you an example. After the Indignados movement, a general social movement in Greece and other countries, we have this that we call somehow, we try to make a rough translation, the direct markets. Markets without a medium.
Peer-to-peer. Peer-to-peer.
No. They were producers agricultural producers, that they were going in the towns and in the cities, but this happened to take place also in the towns, okay? That they were bringing the agricultural products directly from the village and from the countryside. They were bringing in the town. They were defending a square for an afternoon, like for some hours, and they were selling the products directly to the people without paying taxes.